The key question is, what were the main developments in Prussia and Austria from 1848 to 1866? After the failure of the 1848 and 49 revolutions, it seemed that Austrian power had revived. Austrian policy was still based on dominating Germany by keeping it weak and divided. Thus, Germany would only be unified once Austrian strength had been broken. The only country that could do that was Prussia. In the 1850s, Prussia was regarded as the least important of the major powers, but appearances were deceptive. In 1862, Otto von Bismarck was appointed Minister-President of Prussia. 4 years later, Prussia smashed Austria in the 7 Weeks' War and established the North German Confederation. Despite his refusal to accept the imperial crown offered by the Frankfurt Parliament, Prussian King Frederick Wilhelm I was attracted to the idea of a united Germany with himself at its head, providing he had the consent of the princes. In 1849, General Radowitz, an ardent nationalist and an old friend of Frederick Wilhelm, came up with the Prussian Union Plan. His proposal for a little Germany under Prussian leadership met with Frederick Wilhelm's approval. According to the plan, there would be a German federal Reich, which would exclude Austria. It would have a strong central government based on a constitution drawn up by the Frankfurt Parliament, with the King of Prussia as emperor. Although Austria would not be a member of the Reich, there would be a special relationship, a permanent union between the Reich and the Habsburg Empire. This complicated plan, which tried to provide both a Little Germany and Greater Germany solutions, was not acceptable to Austria. Austrian Chief Minister Schwarzenberg saw it as a devious scheme to reduce Austrian influence in Germany. He was not, however, immediately able to mount effective opposition, as internal problems in Austria, not the least of which was the Hungarian uprising, were occupying his attention. This allowed Prussia, whose army was the strongest authority in Germany in 1849, to press on with the plan. A three-kings alliance between Prussia, Saxony, and Hanover was the first step. Then a number of smaller states were persuaded to fall in with the Prussian proposals. Encouraged by his success, Radowitz called a meeting of representatives of all the German states to Erfurt in March 1850 to launch the new Reich. 28 states agreed to the creation of the Prussian-dominated Erfurt Union, but several important states, suspicious of Prussian ambitions and fearful of Austria's reaction, declined to join. Schwarzenberg, having suppressed the Hungarian rising, was able to reassert Austria's position in Germany. He put forward a scheme of his own for a Greater Germany to be governed jointly by delegates from Austria, Prussia, and the larger German states. Attracted by the way in which this proposal seemed to offer them greater political influence, some of the larger states, for example Hanover and Saxony, deserted Prussia and gave their support to Austria. Schwarzenberg now summoned the Diet of the old German Confederation, thought to have been dead and buried, to meet in Frankfurt in May 1850. The response was good, and he was able to announce that the Diet and the Confederation were both alive and well. Thus, by the summer of 1850, there were two assemblies claiming to speak for Germany, the Prussian-led Erfurt Parliament and the Austrian-led Frankfurt Diet. A showdown soon occurred. A revolution in Hesse-Kassel, a member state of the Erfurt Union, prompted its ruler to request help from the Frankfurt Diet, but the Erfurt Parliament also claimed the right to decide the dispute. Hesse-Kassel was of strategic importance because it separated the main part of Prussia from the Rhineland and therefore controlled communications between the two. The Prussian army mobilized. Austria replied with an ultimatum that only the troops of the old Confederation had the right to intervene. Small-scale fighting broke out between Prussian and Confederation troops. Frederick Wilhelm, who had no wish for war, dismissed Radowitz. Edwin Montefel, the new Prussian prime minister, was also anxious to avoid an all-out war. A meeting between Muntefel and Schwarzenberg was arranged at Olmutz on November 29, 1850. Prussia agreed to abandon the Prussian Union plan. The two men also agreed to a conference of states being held at Dresden early in 1851 to discuss the future of Germany. Schwarzenberg had won a major diplomatic victory, and Prussia had suffered a huge humiliation. However, the revival of Austria was not allowed to go as far as Schwarzenberg hoped. His proposal for an Austrian-dominated Middle Europe, incorporating the 70 million people of all the German states and the Habsburg Empire, was not acceptable to the smaller German states, as it would have increased the power of the larger states at their expense. There was strong pressure for a return to the situation of pre-1848. Prussia supported this, and given that the Prussian Union plan was lost, anything from Prussia's point of view was better than accepting the Austrian counterplan. In May 1851, the German Confederation of 1815 was formally re-established, and an alliance between Austria and Prussia appeared to signal a return to the policy of close cooperation. However, relations between Prussia and Austria were far from close. Many Prussians blamed Austria for the humiliation of Olmutz. Some were determined that Prussia should one day dominate a united Germany. Austria clearly stood in the way. In 1856, an emerging Prussian statesman, Otto von Bismarck, commented, "Germany is clearly too small for us both. In that not too distant future, we shall have to fight for our existence against Austria. It is not within our power to avoid that, since the course of the events in Germany has no other solution." In 1849, Schwarzenberg, realizing the political implications of Prussia's economic success, proposed establishing a Zollunion, an extended custom union, between Austria and the Zollverein. This move failed. So too did Schwarzenberg's efforts in 1851 to establish an alternative custom union to include Austria and those German states still outside the Zollverein. Thus, while Austria clung to its political leadership of the Confederation, it was effectively isolated from the Prussian-dominated economic coalition of the German states. Despite industrial expansion and rising exports, Austria's government finances were in difficulties. Taxation was not sufficient to finance the central administration or to maintain an efficient army. By the end of the Crimean War, Austria was economically and financially vulnerable, crippled by the cost of keeping large armies mobilized during the war, and in no state to cope with the depression which swept across Europe in the late 1850s. Here's a chart of the position of Austria after 1848. They managed to stop the Prussian Union plan. They also involved themselves with the problem of Hesse-Kassel and were able to revive the German Confederation, yet they still were unable to come up with a Middle Europe plan in which they controlled nor solved their economic problems. Although Prussia had suffered a serious political setback in 1850 to 51, economically the story was different. In the late 1850s, the Prussian economy boomed. Industrial production, railway building, and foreign trade more than doubled. The reason for Prussian successes are complex. Scholars may have ascribed too much influence to the Zollverein. It did not provide protection for Prussian industries, nor did it create a unified German economy. Other factors may have been equally or more important, such as Prussia had a good education system at various levels. Also, there was plenty of coal, iron, and chemicals. Prussia had a good system of communications. Plus, they had a number of key individuals like Alfred Krupp, the great iron and steel magnate, who played an important role. Historians often disagree about the role played by the Prussian state. Some think it helped economic development, others think it hindered it. For whatever reasons, by the mid-1850s, Prussia was economically strong. Its ability to finance a full-scale war against Austria was increasing year by year. Despite repressive and reactionary policies after 1848 and 49, Prussian liberalism grew in strength. It was supported by an increasingly self-confident middle class. Professors, teachers, civil servants, Protestant pastors, businessmen, and lawyers joined the great national liberal associations and subscribed to liberal journals. Nevertheless, for much of the 1850s, there was a general political apathy in Prussia. Few people bothered to make use of their franchise, and politics was the concern of a small elite, for the most part lawyers and civil servants. Right-wing liberal politicians, traumatized by the experience of 1848, which showed how easily mass involvement in politics could descend into revolution, remained suspicious of full democracy. They were less concerned with strengthening Parliament than with ending the dominant influence of the aristocracy and the army over the government. However, left-wing liberals still argued in favor of universal suffrage and insisted that the masses could be trusted to vote for men of substance and culture. There was one thing on which both liberal wings could agree. That was that national unity was the absolute priority. During the 1850s, Prime Minister Montefiore was prepared to accept limited change as long as it did not lead to any extension of parliamentary influence. He had a particular hatred of liberal professional class, considering them to be arrogant, cowardly, and godless. Nevertheless, he realized that he had to have a degree of popular support. He believed the best way to stabilize society and reduce the chance of revolution was to improve the living conditions of the peasants and the workers. Montefiore was especially concerned to help the peasants. He believed that they were the basis of popular support for the monarchy. All peasants were freed from feudal obligations to their landlords. Special low-interest government loans were available to enable peasants to buy their land. 600,000 did so. In some parts of Prussia, where peasants had moved away to the towns looking for work, there was underpopulation in the countryside, but elsewhere there was overpopulation and great pressure on land. Where this was the case, the government gave peasants financial help to move to less populated areas of the country. There were also reforms in towns. The government set out to help factory workers. Payment of a standard minimum wage was encouraged. Financial help was given to industry. Inspectors were appointed to improve working conditions in factories, and children under 12 were forbidden to do factory work. Also, industrial courts were set up to help in the settlement of disputes. Montefiore believed that ministers had a duty to govern well, and that this meant governing in the best interest of all the people. At the same time, he had no time for democracy and governed without parliament for the whole of his time as prime minister, which was 1850 to 1858. In other ways, he was equally reactionary, imposing strict censorship and restrictions on the freedom of political parties to hold meetings. Prussia in the 1850s was a curious mixture, politically reactionary and repressive, socially reforming and economically prosperous. Prussia, despite being a growing economic power, seemed to be a second-rate player in the 1850s. Having avoided military conflict with Austria in 1850, it then played no role in the Crimean War. However, by remaining strictly neutral, Prussia benefited politically as well as economically. It managed to keep on good terms with the other European powers, especially Russia. Austria also remained neutral, but gained little respect because of its wavering diplomacy, sometimes siding against Russia, sometimes against Britain and France. By 1856, Austria had lost the friendship of Russia without obtaining that of Britain and France. Prussia might have profited from the North Italian War in 1859 if it had supported Piedmont and France against Austria. However, popular feeling in Prussia, as in most German states, was anti-French. Prussia tried to benefit by offering Austria help in exchange for conceding Prussia primacy in Germany. Austria's speedy defeat and underfinanced and ineptly led army was defeated at the battles of Magenta and Solferino by French troops, and its willingness to make peace with Napoleon III prevented Prussia's aims being realized. But at least the war had been a severe blow to Austrian prestige. Austria lost Lombardy in northern Italy to Piedmont. Moreover, the cost of the war had a terrible effect on Austria's already strained finances. Frederick Wilhelm, whose mental balance had always been precarious, became more and more unstable until in 1858 he was declared insane. His brother Wilhelm became regent, and when Frederick Wilhelm died in 1861, Wilhelm succeeded to the throne as Wilhelm I of Prussia. Wilhelm, already 63 when he became king, was to reign for another 27 years. A soldier by training and a conservative by instinct, William was practical, hard-headed, and inflexible, the complete contrast to Frederick Wilhelm. Only Bismarck, his chief minister for nearly the whole of his reign, was ever able to make him change his mind. A devout Protestant, he believed that he was answerable only to God, which made it difficult to argue with him. He was prepared to listen to advice from ministers, but not necessarily to act on it. At heart, he was an absolutist. On becoming regent, he dismissed Montefiore, replacing him with a ministry containing both liberals and conservatives. The atmosphere of comparative freedom led people to talk of a new era. The 1858 elections gave the moderate liberals a small majority in Parliament. They hoped to play a significant role in government, yet Wilhelm had no intention that they should. The strengthening of the army was one of Wilhelm's main concerns. He believed it was the key to the future greatness of Prussia. Little had been done to reform or increase the size of the Prussian army since 1815. The mobilization of the Prussian army during the Northern Italian War in 1859 had been a disaster. The war was over before it could be organized into some degree of readiness. The delay meant Wilhelm lost the opportunity to achieve some political advantage. As a result of this failure, Wilhelm appointed a new Minister of War, General Roon. In 1860, Roon, an administrative genius and an extreme conservative, introduced a bill to reform the military. This aimed to double the regular army size, increase the period of military service from 2 to 3 years, reduce the role played by the inefficient Landwehr, and recruit the troops. The Landwehr was a middle-class reserve force that could be called up for service in an emergency. Many of its officers were old and poorly trained. Roon's bill touched a number of sensitive points as far as the liberal majority in Prussia's parliament was concerned. The liberals feared that the government might use this to expand the army not for the defense of Prussia from foreign attack, but against its own people, as it happened in 1848 and 49. Moreover, the civilian army, despite its military shortcomings, was popular with liberals. While there was some room for compromise on detail, both sides believed that important principles were at stake. Wilhelm was determined that army matters should be kept above parliamentary approval. Liberals believed that Parliament should have financial control over the army. Without such a right, it had very little power. The Army Bill thus led to a constitutional crisis. In 1860, Parliament would agree only to approve the increased military budget for a year and would not agree to extend the term of military service to 3 years. In June 1861, radical liberals formed the Progressive Party. The progressives were committed to a popular rather than a royal army. In the newly elected parliament in December 1861, the progressives became the largest party. Parliament would not pass the money bill for the army, and Wilhelm would not accept 2 years military service. Wilhelm again dissolved Parliament and replaced his liberal ministers with conservatives. The May 1862 elections were a disaster for the king and a triumph for the progressives who, in alliance with the other opposition groups, now had an overall majority in the lower house. In September, Parliament again refused to pass the army bill. Some Prussian conservatives hoped that this would lead to a royal coup and the overthrow of the Constitution. Instead, Wilhelm, fearing civil war in Prussia, contemplated abdication. However, on September 22nd, on the advice of Roon, he appointed Otto von Bismarck as his chief minister. This was one of the most momentous occasions in Prussian, German, and European history. Bismarck's appointment as chief minister was seen as a deliberate affront to the Prussian liberals. They regarded him as a bigoted reactionary. Given that he had no minister experience, he was not expected to last long in power. On September 30th, 1862, in his first speech to the Prussian parliament, Bismarck declared, "Germany does not look to Prussia's liberalism, but to its power. It is not through speeches and majority decisions that the great questions of the day are decided. That was the great mistake of 1848-49. It is by iron and blood." This phrase, afterwards reversed to blood and iron, became almost synonymous with Bismarck. In truth, the speech was not his greatest effort. What he had meant to say was that if Prussia was to fulfill its role in leading Germany towards greater unity, it could not do so without an efficient army, which the king's government was seeking to build. His speech, aimed at winning liberal support, badly misfired. To most liberal nationalists, such blood-curdling talk from a notorious reactionary was seen as a deliberate provocation. Bismarck thus failed to build any bridges to his political opponents. In the end, he solved the problem of the military budget by withdrawing it, declaring that support of Parliament for the Army Bill was unnecessary, as the army reforms could be financed from taxation. To liberal suggestions that the people refused to pay taxes, Bismarck replied that he had 200,000 soldiers ready to persuade them. While Austria declined, Prussia ascended to a position of power after 1848. The international situation looked good. They had economic success and some conservative reform in terms of social things, but they were a weird mix of autocratic political rule with social reforms. Everything changes when Bismarck is appointed in 1862. He's going to ignore Prussian liberals for a time, but later he will use them quite extensively. In the end, Bismarck solved this problem by becoming stronger than Parliament. Parliament did declare his actions illegal, but he ignored it. The taxes were collected and the army was reorganized as if Parliament did not exist. For 4 years and through 2 wars, he directed Prussian affairs without constitutionally approved budgets and in the face of fierce parliamentary opposition. New elections in 1863 gave the Liberals 70% of the parliamentary seats. "Men spat on the place where I trod in the streets," Bismarck wrote later. But he rightly judged that his opponents would avoid an appeal to force. Few wanted a repeat of 1848.